Okay, we're ready, I think, if everyone's here. So this is the final session of the day, and it's going to be about media in the Gulf. Thank you all for staying and listening to this session. We'll be talking about the current state of the media, both legacy media and new media in the Gulf, and what are the hopes for freedom of expression, and how can those hopes be realized. My name is Rodri Davis. I'm a freelance journalist. I have a kind of rather nuanced experience of media in the Gulf, having worked for Al Jazeera English for 6 years on digital and in broadcast. So, you know, Al Jazeera English is a state broadcaster, but not a public service broadcaster. And we'll be talking about the range of kind of media throughout the region. But obviously, as we know, the story of media in the Gulf is one of overwhelming state dominance. And we've seen the proliferation of new media in the Gulf before and post-Arab Spring. But those mediums have again been co-opted by governments, so we've seen changes there as well, but we'll talk more about that with our speakers. We've got Haifa Halfala, is that right? And she's an academic, but more relevant to this session, she's a former journalist who's worked in Kuwait with Al-Watan newspaper, which is now defunct, I think, but it was no, is it not? Is it, no, is it? But it's but it's an independent newspaper, yeah. And you worked with Al-Kabas, a daily Arabic newspaper, and as well you've been involved with Index on Censorship and Article 19, so freedom of expression organizations. And we have also Bill Law, who's reported extensively from the Middle East and North Africa for the BBC until about 2014. You were the BBC's Gulf analyst, correct? And you now are an analyst, and you've just been named editor of the Arab Digest, which is an analyst service provider. So first of all, just to get us started, we are going to have two videos. One from Sheikha Al-Jassim from the University of Kuwait, and another from Adel Marcuz, who's the editor-in-chief of Gulf House for Studies and Publishing, and the president of the Bahrain Press Association. Mohammed. Are we gonna? Are they all right, Mohammed? Okay. Should we come back to them? Yeah. Well, we can just. We'll just start with an opening little chat about what makes a media environment that's conducive to freedom of expression and a good free press. I think from my experience working in a newsroom, at a place like Al Jazeera and elsewhere. I now work at the BBC and Associated Press. You've got to have that open flow of communication. And you've got to be able to say whatever you want in a newsroom. As soon as that starts to become limited, then you're not going to have a product, which is also about freedom of expression and able to poke at any area of the world and any issue properly. Haifa, for yourself, what do you think are the conditions and the structures necessary to have a good free press and media? Yeah. Okay, and Bill?
I think it's important to have freedom. I think it's also important to have responsibility. That freedom doesn't come without responsibility. And I think part of that responsibility is that open flow of communication and that ability to listen, sometimes to views you don't like to hear. But I think that's very important.
Yeah, for sure. I think at Al Jazeera English, it was the kind of saving grace of Al Jazeera English, and it, of course, it got a lot of prominence worldwide, but the saving grace was that Qatar wasn't the issue of the day the vast majority of the time. So those issues weren't quite such a problem in the newsroom. Yeah, and I think that, you know, okay, there were still other issues there, and there were still other ways that coverage was skewed one way or another, but that's how Al Jazeera English is kind of able to gain prominence and gain a good image. Can we do the videos now, Mohammed? We'll go. Okay, we'll come back to them. Okay, so now Haifa, in your experience, I mean, you've got obviously good experience of Kuwait, but then much more broadly in the Gulf as well. I mean, what's the kind of current state of play, do you think, in the media landscape? Both kind of, well, let's talk about traditional legacy media.
Thank you very much. I also worked as the Middle East editor of the Flash Energy Service, which is the Bible for energy industry. So I saw it from both sides, and I see my contribution to this panel, which I was drafted very late, is to provide a longer and geographically wider lens to dangers facing the media in the Gulf and other Arab-speaking countries. These are threats to the world, not only to the Gulf. To begin with,
الباب نحو التغيير. دول الخليج تعتمد بشكل أساسي على أسرها.
Do you want to carry on, Haifa, and we'll come to the videos once the... yeah, I think... Mohammed, what do you want to do, Mohammed? Continue, okay.
I begin with something you mentioned. I would like to remind us all, especially those of us who are not as ancient as I am, that at a certain time in the 1980s, the center of Arabic language, free press, dynamic thought, and new democracy of Islamic experience was Kuwait, that is the Gulf. It had ceased to be Egypt or Lebanon or indeed the Western Mediterranean or North African shores. I know because I had the fortune to work as a journalist in Kuwait at that time. It wasn't planned, it was just a sheer.
Yeah, you can just...
I turned into journalist by the sheer energy and the daring vision of so many Kuwaitis and other citizens Dawla, as well as Arabic-speaking countries, that Kuwait attracted them at the time, just as a flower attracts butterflies. Freedom. I started at Al-Watan, that became moved to Al-Qabas as the first Arab woman who had an economic section of the business group paper, Al-Qabas. It comes all, when you started, and I think Bill mentioned it, it comes all to credibility. Because freedom has the other side of the equation of freedom is credibility and holding power to account. The word press, the rest of the world believed our stories and indeed quoted us. And as a result, in Al-Watan, in this small, tiny state, and this is the power of freedom and the weight of free press. In a small, tiny state, I remember we had the absolute who's who of the Arabic-speaking intelligentsia come to us, ambassadors of the world powers of the United States, of all Arab ambassadors, and people from the World Bank, etc. The interesting part about this flowering of free press, and again I'd like us to remember, all of us always remember this, that as the press in Kuwait constantly pushed for more freedom, for more professionalism, newspapers, because the rest of the media is state-owned, of course, TV and radio. The cause of free press and the publications themselves became fashionable. It became prestigious. And this is how I actually moved to Al-Qabas, who decided they would bolster its image with the most daring and the best. So my story is the story of three of us. It's not of me alone. Of three journalists, or three people who worked in the free press and were victims of censorship. But these were the lucky victims, the ones that were, because the other two are far more famous than me, because the world knows about them. And outwardly we look okay. Of course we're not okay. I had been a successful journalist covering OPEC. They brought Najil Ali, the impressible, well-known cartoonist, who was at the time, if I remember, was living in Lebanon. And most of all, their own, until that time, unappreciated poet, Ahmed Matar, became, all of a sudden, as he should have been, one of their stars, and they started boasting about him. It was an intelligent move to be saluted, regardless of the intentions of the owners. But, and this is the question, is, this is the problem that faces us all. It's not a problem of free media, it's a problem of tyranny. Because tyranny, we can speak about the free media from here until the day of judgment. It doesn't make any difference. As long as there are tyranny, none of us are safe. And that's the problem, because good governance is not a privilege. It is an oxygen. So the goons of dictators in the region, in my case, the dictator next door, his name was Saddam Hussein, and his goons sifted my papers. I can tell you from here till tomorrow, it's only when they threatened my parents in Cairo that I will be physically with it. Economic journalism, in some ways, is heartless. It's apolitical. Then I decided to move to London, and did that as well. But soon after, the governments, the other dictators of the Gulf pushed the Kuwaiti government to kick out from Kuwait, from the whole Gulf, Najir Ali, the cartoonist, somebody who Googled, and Ahmed Matar. He's a poet. So they, luckily for me, Al-Qabas had an office in London, so they came to London, and here we were again, 3 of us. The amazing thing is that when you censor somebody, you make them tough, you make them tougher. And indeed, with Index, and I have to say this, and I stress it 100 times, thanks to the intelligentsia, what's the British intelligentsia, of every sort, journalists, rabbi, whoever you can mention, 3 of us prospered. And thanks to our colleagues in the region, we continue to publish, and this time not only in Arabic, but in English, across the world, from America, because I had joined also McGraw-Hill as the Middle East editor of Class. So here, our agency not only wasn't intact, we increased, and we thought we were doing fine, and we thought that we'd won the day. This is why I said tyranny is a problem, because never, we can think we succeeded for a day, but it doesn't happen that way. Najir Ali was murdered in South Kensington Street. Ahmed Matar shrank into himself, and I had the pleasure of having Italian poison administered to me and lived my life for a few years. So, and we were reminded that with the murder of Marhum Jamal Khashoggi, that it reaches everywhere, from the streets of London to Istanbul, to everywhere. And here I was, a journalist for a top American publishing house, the Bible of the oil industry, and it reached me. And it actually reached Western journalists. And therefore, none of us is ever safe. I'll end up. I'm sorry for being long, but this is long-winded. But I just want to remind everybody that it was Najir Ali, the dead Najir Ali, Ahmed Matar, even Marhum Jamal Khashoggi, had been lucky to survive. And we continue to survive. They, the 3 of them, they live far longer than their oppressors. But it's the hundreds of thousands, our colleagues, everywhere, across the years, that none of us, including you and other journalists, we don't know about, is that what should be our concern, something that should make us not sleep at night.
Thanks. I mean, so Bill is talking about kind of how people work on the ground, media people work on the ground, and how people work outside of Gulf countries. I mean, that's very much where we are, do you think, in your experience?
Well, first of all, I just want to pay credit to you, Haifa, and to your colleagues. And it is an extraordinarily difficult journey that particularly Arab journalists have taken, and the courage that they have shown. And we've reached a kind of, I think, terrible place now, which is very concerning, because I feel like outside of the Gulf, I mean, we're seeing the attacks on media across the world. Journalists are being imprisoned, journalists are being attacked. The credibility of journalism is under assault by the President of the United States on a daily basis. So we are in a very difficult place. Myself, as a journalist, I remember the first time that I figured out a way to get into Saudi Arabia, because after that story, the film of the princess, there was a fatwa against any BBC journalist. I was able to get in finally, I think it was in 2002, which is the first time that I met Jamal Khashoggi. And the excitement I felt, that here I was, in a place that was kind of a mysterious kingdom, a desert kingdom. And I was able to do stories, and amongst the best stories I did were actually interviewing women, because women were more prepared to speak out, because they felt so frustrated. At that time, women could only go into two professions, health or teaching. And women who wanted to be journalists were severely frustrated in that situation. Subsequently, and I went back to Saudi many times, I did a lot of work in Bahrain. The issue that you face as a Western journalist is mild. I mean, I was detained a couple of times in Bahrain. There were a couple of moments in Saudi Arabia where I felt a little insecure, if you will. But the people that I interviewed, the people who were there, the people in place who had the courage to speak, they're the ones that pay the price. And I still feel it, every day. I think about people that I have interviewed. I have friends who are in prison, good friends who are in prison. And I think the challenge, and dead, sadly, and dead. And I think the challenge is that we must not, and I think Matthew Hedges used the phrase, we must not normalize this behavior. We mustn't accept this appalling situation. We have to find ways to challenge it. But equally, I feel the need to be careful that we don't put too much pressure and expectation on people who are in those countries. Because now, particularly with Mohammed bin Salman, it's clear that it's not good enough simply not to criticize, that your silence is seen as an implicit criticism. Therefore, you must, if you want to remain a journalist, be a propagandist. You must flog the propaganda. You must flog the lies, which must be the cruelest thing for a journalist to face. So I think that there are huge, huge challenges. And I do also want to speak about Al-Wasat in Bahrain, which was shuttered in 2017. It was an independent voice, so precious, so unique, really, in the Gulf. I mean, I remember the first time I was in Kuwait. It was just ahead of the war in 2003, and I was struck by even then, the vibrancy of the media compared to what I'd experienced in Saudi Arabia in particular. But, we take so much for granted here. We've got to remember, I think, that the people in place are facing it, and now I think it's even more difficult and more challenging. And with Al-Wasat, closed in 2017, not a word mentioned. I mean, there was virtually silence when this and a hugely brave and generous editor, Mansour Jamri, who struggled to keep that publication going. In 2011, it was shut down. The goons were sent in to wreck the printing presses. The reporters were seized. The photojournalists were seized. They were beaten up. And most awfully, the co-founder, Karim al-Fakawi, was beaten to death in a jail cell. And it was only because this came to light that the couple of people who had been told to beat him were sentenced to 7 years, and they got knocked down to 3 years. So I wanted to mention these very, very brave people that we here in the West sometimes put the question, why aren't they speaking up more? Well, they can't. That's the reality.
And there are other examples as well. Raif Badawi in Saudi, a blogger. Mواطن here from Oman set up online websites talking against the government, and Mohammed is now in exile, and numerous others. So if we don't want to put too much pressure on people in these countries, where is the space for debate? Where is the space for some kind of dialogue on the issues? Is it always outside of the country? Even then, is that still a problem? Haifa?
It
pressure is something that we didn't choose. It was put on us. So don't worry about us and as what we'll do. In fact, keep adding us to do more. Please do. What it is important is people like Bill, like you, like the media, and from my experience in indexing censorship and as a consultant in a couple of projects for Amnesty International, really, Western media and Western intelligentsia, the good part of it is very, very good, and it can be, it's a partnership, it's a human partnership. If there is ever a human partnership, it's this. So perhaps the way forward is to try to push it furthermore in the priorities of key Western media. This is my thing.
Bill, do you agree with that? Do you have anything?
Yeah, I think that's, yes, I do agree. I think that's, it's very important to keep the pressure up, particularly now, and in the previous session, mention was made of the FCO and the fact the FCO has done so little to address the issues of human rights. I mean, the situation we've got now is that this is a country that's just bedeviled and perplexed and obsessed with Brexit. But that's an easy out, isn't it? Because the various government departments say, we can't deal with anything else. We've got to figure out Brexit. And that's, it's just not good enough, is it? Because you don't park human rights. You don't park the lives of people at risk. You don't park the fact that many, it's not just the journalists, their families. I mean, the families have paid, and the human rights activists, their families have paid an enormous price. It's gone on for years and years. And of course, the situation in America, once Trump came in, any pretense towards human rights was just dropped without any consideration. So there we are. We are faced with this huge difficulty. I think we do have to keep finding ways, creative ways, to keep the story in front of people. And Hatice Cengiz, who I believe is here, has done an enormous, the fiancé of Jamal Khashoggi, has done an enormously courageous efforts all across the world, speaking about the terrible, atrocious murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And yes, Davos in the desert this year, all of these entrepreneurs came back and spent their time listening to pitches from Mohammed bin Salman's henchmen. You know what? There are people who didn't go. So, we should be looking at the ones who didn't go still. There are people who did withdraw funding. And Mohammed bin Salman is in a difficult place because if he doesn't deliver Vision 2030, which I think is a good shot, he won't deliver it, then, people are going to begin to ask other questions. In the meantime, it's important to remind people that what he's trying to do is to silence completely any form of criticism, including criticism of Vision 2030. And this whole Saudi Aramco IPO, which I'd love to hear your thoughts on, perhaps over a coffee, is showing just how vulnerable he is. So I think we do not and must not lose hope. And we must salute people like Hatice Cengiz who have done an enormous job in keeping the story of the fight for a free and open media and freedom, really, the right to speak, just the right to speak. I mean, I have a friend, this is going back 2 years, she said, Bill, the walls are closing in. We can't breathe. We can't breathe. And I wrote an article about that, and I titled it, I Can't Breathe. There was an African-American who was suffocated by the police, and his last words were, I can't breathe. We have to find the space. We have an obligation to find the space so that we allow people to find the right to breathe. I think that's very important, and I think journalism plays a huge role in doing that.
Great. We'll pick back up of that, we're just going to go to the videos, which are apparently ready. So first of all, we've got Sheikha as Jami, Al Jasim, pardon?
أم الحريات وهي الباب نحو التغيير. دول الخليج تعتمد بشكل أساسي على أسر حاكمة، والأسر الحاكمة بطبيعة الحال تريد أن توطن من سيطرتها وتؤكد سيطرتها، ولذلك هي تستخدم أي الطرق الممكنة سواء المال السياسي سواء يعني السياسات الداخلية أو الخارجية فقط لتوطيد سلطتها وبقائها في السلطة. إضافة إلى الوفرة المادية عند الشعوب، فهذا يجعل الناس مرتاحين ولا يعبؤون بالتغيير. إضافة إلى أن بعضهم يعاني من الأمية السياسية، لا يعلم ما هي حقوقه. لذلك أنا أرى بأن الحرية، حرية التعبير هي أساس التغيير في كل دول الخليج، لأن لو كانت هذه الحرية موجودة، والتي بعضها موجودة طبعا، هناك فرق ما بين الدول، هناك دول تعتبر حرية التعبير فيها معدومة نهائيا، وهناك دول أفضل من غيرها، ولكن حرية التعبير هي المدخل أولا لزيادة وعي الشعوب نحو التغيير السياسي والاجتماعي والاقتصادي، وأن ذلك في مصلحتهم، أيضا للمخاطبة مع السلطة وللتخاطب والحوار ويعني حتى نعرف إلى أين نحن ذاهبين. أنا أعتقد هذه حرية التعبير نقطة أساسية تجعلنا جميعا كشعوب وكأسر حاكمة نذهب إلى ديمقراطية وإلى مستقبل أفضل.
Great, and we have a second video, which is from Adel Marcuz.
تحية طيبة إلى جميع الحضور في هذا المؤتمر. أنا هو الخاسر الأكبر لأني لن أستمع إلى مداخلاتكم، فقط تستمعون أنتم إلى هذه المداخلة. خاسر أكبر لأني لن أستمع إلى مداخلة أيضا الصديقين صفاء الأحمد والصديق بلو. تحدي الوجود والمزاحمة. الدولة تستخدم نشاطا أسميه بالبابليسيتي، النشر، تقوم باستخدام هذا النشاط في مجال الجورناليزم أو الصحافة. ما يبث في دول الخليج من وسائل الإعلام هو ليس صحافة، ولا إن كان يتمظهر في شكل صحف أو عمل صحفي، هو في النهاية عملية نشر لهذه الحكومات والدول. القدرة على الوجود داخل هذه التنظيمات القانونية التي تضعها دول الخليج هو أول التحديات. مزاحمة هذا القطاع الضخم والشبكات الضخمة التي تمثل قطاع النشر للدولة، هذا أيضا تحدي كبير. التحدي الثاني هو تحدي البقاء. هنا لا أتحدث عن الصحافة في الخليج فقط، هو تحدي للصحافة كلها في كل مكان. كيف تستمر هذه المؤسسات الصحفية مستقلة مادية، قادرة على أن تكون مؤسسات في مجتمع مدني حقيقية دون تمويل سياسي من الدولة أو حتى من المعارضات. هذه إشكالية كبيرة لا تخص منطقة الخليج فحسب. اليوم لدينا الصحف في أوروبا، في بريطانيا، في فرنسا، في الولايات المتحدة نشتكي وتشتكي كثير من الأوساط بأنها تنزع سياسيا وأنها تستجيب للمال السياسي. التحدي الثالث هو تحدي القدرة والإبداع. القدرة على الخلق والإبداع، بمعنى استطاعة الصحفيين والمؤسسات الصحفية على تنويع أدواتها ومنصاتها التي تستخدمها في القيام بمهامها. نحن نطور الأدوات، دخلنا في عالم التواصل الاجتماعي، لكن الدول الخليج لم تكن عاجزة أيضا عن تطوير آلياتها في الملاحقة والمراقبة للصحفيين أو حتى للنشطاء في المجتمع المدني. التحدي الرابع تحدي الحماية والتأمين. العمل فرادى لن يفيد، التأخر في حماية الصحفيين وفي تأمين سلامتهم لا يفيد. لقد دفعت منطقة الخليج ضحايا، قدمت ضحايا أهمهم أو آخرهم هو جمال خاشقجي. أعتقد أن على المؤسسات الصحفية والنقابات ومؤسسات المجتمع المدني التي تهتم بملف الصحافة والإعلام في الخليج أن تكون واعية إلى أهمية تطوير آلية تدخل سريع لحماية الصحفيين والنشطاء في منطقة الخليج. دمتم بخير.
Great. We can just pick up on something that Adele was saying there, that the way social media has developed in the region, we see countries like Saudi Arabia, the fourth biggest user of Twitter in the world. But as that space has opened, it's also been crushed, and those tools have been used by states to crack down upon and oppress people who want freedom of expression. Bill, is that something that's kind of generic across the countries in the Gulf, or are there differences there?
Yeah, I remember when the internet first came on stream, you know, that seems like a long time ago because we always lived with it. It's not that long ago, but the line then was you cannot regulate the internet. It's just impossible. And effectively that's the situation in Western democracies. Is the internet is an open space. Anybody can say anything that they basically want to. Some of it is very, very good. Some of it's awful. And then, you know, along comes Donald Trump to completely redefine the landscape and the geography once more in his use of tweets. But the idea that, you know, the social online can't not be regulated. In fact, what we're seeing in the Gulf is, yeah, oh, yes, it can. You can buy, because you've got the resources, you can buy the best malware, the best surveillance. You can pass laws, cybersecurity laws, call them anti-terrorism laws, to crush any free speech. And we saw that with Nabil Rajab, who criticized the war in Yemen, 5 years for that, for a tweet. So the point is that, yeah, the internet is severely, savagely regulated in the Gulf states.
And not just, though, through laws. I mean, through harassment, trolling by government employees that really cuts people off from, can drown people out, and also put people in such a difficult position that they don't want to speak, so they censor themselves. I mean, is that something which is the same in kind of Kuwait, do you think? Do you know?
Country or that country, because it's come even into the West, with some of the new laws against radicalism, and Twitter itself is doing, especially Twitter and media. I don't know. I'm sure a lot of people know what they've been doing. They're doing their own censorship. So rather than saying this or that country, perhaps we as journalists, the media in general, should start, or as much as we don't like some of the persons that cut journalists into pieces and put them wherever it is, maybe we should change the discourse a bit, I don't know, and focus on a corrupt political culture, wherever it is. It's a very dangerous political culture that we cannot accept as humans with shared values, rather than this country or that country, because I think media companies are now getting into the act of censorship.
Can we talk about one thing coming before the other? Political change, social change, media change? Or not really? Okay, and I mean, so where then do we kind of go from here? You know, what kind of hope is there for that progress then that you're talking about?
Seriously, your question is very, very important, because when you create a cage that you keep people in, not only do you dehumanize them, you make them less intelligent and less able to come up with solutions. Our friend here, Ustad Anwar, in the Sessions said, why can't we have solution? Why can't we? We can't because we're not used to discussing political thought. The minute you talk political, and this is a long tradition. I'm a historian and it goes back in history. If you stop them discussing a subject, they will be unintelligent, simplistic when it comes to this subject, and they won't be able to find a way out. So, and it makes them also dangerous to the rest of the world.
Yeah, Bill, did you want to add anything?
Well, I did want to add something, and it was about this political thing. We try as much as we try as any autocrat might try to squeeze out a real American. It's right that people. Is that better? Yeah. Okay. That people do get desensitized and they stop asking questions. But, you know, that's the role of journalism, is to ask questions and speak to the crowd. Can I just do something with this? I wanted to, you mentioned poetry, and poetry is so much a part of Gulf and Arab culture. This is coming back to al-Wasat. This is a poem by a young Bahraini. And I asked him if I might read it today because I told him I was going to be talking about media. And his name's Ali Al-Jamli. He's the son of Al-Jamli. He was the last editor and publisher of Al-Wasat. Al-Wasat, this site, the media site, and the newspaper closed down in 2017, but in 2019, building was demolished. Ali has written, it's called After the Last Edition. The ink stains on the rollers, like so much coughed up blood, are dried to the touch. Halls echo desertion, and dust mates with dust. None knock but the bulldozer. None knock but the man in the hookah. The stories, the photos, the rusted presses, they cannot speak. The bulldozer rumbles a Bedouin language, deep, guttural, prehistoric, one extended moan. Yet even as snapping metal shrieks beneath collapsing walls, a loose sheet flutters free. It carries an ink-stained olive branch.
So, fairly bleak on the whole, though, really, you'd say that. And
but the last two lines were they are about hope and about that unquenchable thirst. That's the important thing that I would like us to take away.
And we've had the situation with Jamal's murder, and you know where these governments, well, Saudi is going far outside of its own country to stop people from speaking out. So where are those voices coming from now? We've had that situation, which is, you know, you would think would push back a lot of the kind of movement for freedom of expression. What do you think? Do you think it has, or do you think there are voices there?
I think the voices are there. I think we, you know, it's an existential struggle. It's not just about the Gulf. It's, as Nina said, this is a worldwide struggle we're engaged in. And journalists, yes, are on the front line. And journalists have paid, you know, not in the West, at least not yet, but in places and regions, in the Gulf, in the Middle East, in Pakistan, in Turkey, in China, they pay terrible, terrible prices. But we need to acknowledge that we are in a war, and in war you have to figure out strategies. So it's a good question that we need to start to devise some strategies and some fight back. But the first strategy is not abandon hope. That's what I believe is the starting point. And also I think that there's so much strength and intelligence and energy and determination among young Arabs. You know, that's the power, that's the source. You know, no bogey like me, who cares? But, you know, it's that young, and they're not going to accept. They've already said we don't accept the social contract that our parents agreed to, which is we give you everything you want, but don't ask any difficult questions. You know, right now, the reason why there's so much repression is because these ruling families know those difficult questions are surfacing, and they're trying to find a way to shut them down. And, you know, at some point, the mechanisms they're using, and history shows this, they will fail. So we've got to be there to record that story, I think.
And Haifa, I mean, are you able to point to anything kind of structurally that's able to change, presumably outside of the Gulf countries, that can help those voices come to the surface and, you know, help them proliferate?
If we would go back to the role of the world media again, because journalism is this, of course I say that, my father was a journalist, I was a journalist, but these brilliant, real journalists, not court jesters, and they're a bit of a Colombo, they're a bit of this, they're a bit of that, they are multi-talented. So one of the things we really need to do, I can't include myself because I'm not a journalist anymore, but to be able to differentiate between voices of opposition that are calling for reforms and voices of oppositions that are just noises, or I call them the past dancers. I just want to return to some, hypothetical past or whatever, and there are different pasts, or some people who think themselves, they use these fancy progressive, radical, which is really meaningless. So it's really up, because journalists write the first draft of history, and the most brilliant draft of history. And in so doing, they sort out a lot of the fluff in events. And in the West, we need, because now the Western media, whether you like it or not, is at the forefront of journalism, still fighting this fight, what's going on in the United States or anywhere else, that we need to be nuanced and to ask more questions, and not to believe, and so are human rights organizations, because I think human rights organizations, if they have a problem now, international human rights organization, is this almost simplistic view of the word, oh, human rights versus the bad guy. It doesn't happen that way. Some people who call for change call for negative change, if you listen very carefully to what they say. And some people are brilliant, and some of those brilliant people, brilliant intellectuals, are right now in jails, in Saudi jails. I can't see Yahya al-Asiri. Yahya al-Asiri has a good friend. That guy, I never knew. Okay, there you are. I'm talking about Abdullah al-Maliki. I didn't know him. I followed him in Twitter. And my mind was blown with the energy. Why is this energy in jail? The price of the Arabian Peninsula is paying now and in the future for this specific guy, just one guy in jail, is huge for him.
And in terms of, we've spoken a little bit about Western media outlets being a source or a place where these voices can be heard, or where you can talk against the governments. What about, I mean, Bill, you run, you're an editor of a subscription service analytical publication. I mean, do you think that there are different modes of being able to finance outlets whereby these voices can be heard? I mean, you're seeing things in the West now where they're trying to do different subscription service, let's say something like The Correspondent in the Netherlands, where people pay for a subscription and you get a very kind of different type of content. It's not following the news, it's talking about issues that readers suggest they want to hear. I mean, do you think that there's a model that makes something viable financially and sustainably?
Yeah, I think that it's really important to figure out different financial models. One of the things, Arab Digest almost passed away last week, and I wanted to keep it going because it is an independent site. It is not tied to, and we know just how much money the Gulf ruling families have splashed out in all kinds of areas and the kind of influence they've had. Most of it negative, most of it. Of course, Al Jazeera, particularly Al Jazeera English, has done some very, benchmark work, set the standard for the quality of journalism that we should aim for. And Al Jazeera Arabic, we could have a conversation about, certainly in view of things like, yes, we could do. But I think, it's important that particularly in the West, as we say, that people can go to a site and they know that the journalism is independent and it's quality journalism, it's objective. And I think Eva's made a very important point, is that we need as journalists to examine everybody's motives. And simply banging away about human rights can have negative consequences, particularly for the people who are in situ and are affected by those, by the campaigns. I think that's another discussion, perhaps. But yeah, I think we're on the cusp of either losing the battle or trying to figure out a way where independent journalism can be financed by people paying small amounts of money. And, the compromises that big media make can be quite devastating. I mean, I would point to my previous organization, the BBC, and the role that it has played in the Brexit campaign, for example, or the extent to which the BBC fell under the influence of the Israeli lobby. So in some ways, there are huge opportunities still online for the kind of journalism that I'm trying to promote on Arab Digest, that various other sources are trying to do, and I think that's probably the way forward. So small is beautiful, and big has lots of problems tied to it.
Yep. I think this really sums it up. If we, as journalists, make credibility and seriousness attractive and pays and prestigious, we can attract funds. And this is why I started with the experience in Kuwait. It was attractive, even the two most dubious characters. And this is a challenge. The problem with corporate media, it becomes a corporate. But the bottom line is credible, serious, attractive.
Great. I was going to try and finish on an optimistic note, and you've already done it, so great. And we can open it up to the floor, actually. Haven't got loads of time, but we've got some time for a few questions, if anyone's got any.
Is this on, or? Yeah. To what extent do you think we can fairly assess that sort of liberal democracies have come to a formidable way in developing rights-based cybersecurity laws? And if that is a negative assessment, do you think that lack of progress in that area is undermining sort of the role of activists and policymakers to seriously benchmark cybersecurity laws certainly developed in more authoritarian regimes?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. It's a tough question, because I do think that liberal democracy is under assault, and one of the ways it's under assault is because there is a lack of regulation on social media. But as Heba said, is once you bring in regulation, it becomes another issue, and who brings it in? If a government brings in those regulations, that raises issues. If it's the company that brings it in, you mentioned Twitter started, Facebook started. Yeah, but how far can you trust them? And yet at the same time, I think we do have to find some way to protect the values of liberal democracy, one of which is freedom of expression. It's a conundrum. I would hope that more pressure is brought to bear on these big corporations, on Twitter, on Facebook, to show more responsibility in terms of what they themselves are allowing up. I mean, when I was at the BBC as a producer, there was a guidebook, and there were things that you didn't put in. And if you did put them in, you had to have them, you know, double sourced, copper bottom, we used to say. You know, all of these things have been simply swept aside. Maybe we need to look at the old way and find a way to work that into the new challenge that we're facing.
I think there is a problem though, that if even, for instance, take China and the difference between how social media plays out in the West and in China, what content's allowed on those platforms, that even if we have regulations in America or in England, that might not apply in Saudi, for instance. Yeah, it's quite difficult, right? Any other questions?
Well, no, regarding what we are now seeing across the Gulf is the idea of regulating social media, or what they call content of social media, not banning social media, but what goes into that, and really, and the material that people write or say can be used against them in the public prosecution. So like somebody retweets a story, that means he or she agrees with the material that was retweeted, with the total content, or puts a like on an Instagram account. You know, so really, I see really more dangers ahead rather than more smiles ahead in the Gulf, really, with this idea of regulating, bringing some models, like from Singapore, the model of spreading fake news, and from other countries in the Gulf, and from China. So people, and the authorities are using this argument that we have to regulate that. You know, this is the age of technology, money laundering, infringement of privacy, really. And this is a space that has not been regulated. And that's very serious. Really, I think really there is need for attention, because what we're going to see is people leaving, more people leaving and all going underground. So I can see really more dangers ahead if left alone.
Yeah, I think it's an area which is in such flux. It's very difficult, because actually you see some countries taking total control of their internet services. So you want to keep it an openness, but again, you need some form of regulation. It's very difficult, right? And someone at the back.
I would like to talk about the audience and the access to information they have. The Gulf have been censoring websites for decades, and that's one of the regions that use the most censorship, and many websites, news websites in particular, are censored. I'm wondering, like, how social media has disrupted that, like, and how much people, and young people in particular, are accessing information on their countries online via maybe dissident people reporting the news, human rights violations under the radar in secret. So do you see any like rising citizen initiative, dissident voices using social media to report on local news? And yeah, how much young people have access to non-official information online?
Well, I think that the Gulf, the penetration, I think the point was made that Twitter is hugely popular in Saudi Arabia. And I think when it first hit, there was this kind of, and you can understand it, massive excitement, because you get these chat rooms where young men and young women could have conversations which they can't have, or couldn't have. This is before the reforms of Mohammed bin Salman. Couldn't have, in a cafe. So that was very exciting and very ennobling. And I think there was the sense then that we can engage, we can have conversations, because to go back to young people very much want to be part of a new narrative in the Gulf. But they're being denied that. When they engaged in that, and when they pushed a little far, Ray Badawi is a perfect example of that. They were jailed. The ruling families are afraid. They are afraid of that energy. But as I said earlier, you can't tamp it down. You can do, and people are paying terrible prices right now for it. But eventually, that energy will override the autocrats. In terms of what's available, yeah, there are exchanges, but people in places like Saudi Arabia have to be very careful because the surveillance technology is, extraordinary. And so, and Jassim has made the point that they keep ramping it up. So if, for example, you are discovered to be following, not even retweeting, but following the views of someone who's critical of Mohammed bin Salman, you're in trouble. So there's been actually a clampdown. So there's less available. And meanwhile, in Saudi, the deal is we will give you entertainment. Young men and young women can go to music concerts. You can see Mariah Carey and you can do all these exciting things, and we'll build you an entertainment city. We're doing all these but don't ever think that means that you can actually say anything critical or you can use your critical faculties. Well, as Haifa said, you're disempowering the future, and it won't work. But to answer your question, I think that the availability of news sources is shrinking, of objective sources. But I don't think the battle's lost. No, I don't.
I may add to this. We seem to forget something. I know it's in the box, and therefore we don't pay attention to a very serious fact that the dictators realize far better than us, is that a place like Twitter, social media like Twitter, has become the effective parliament of a country, of the region, that anybody can be a member of and can exchange views openly. And that's very, very dangerous. And therefore it changed, and we wanted to get that in the first session, into a discussion about that. Unfortunately, we didn't have time, about the definition of the political. In the Arab world, are you from the Arab world? Are you Arabic speaker? In many places, the word political itself is totally misunderstood to mean that sacred space of the Sultan, of the absolute ruler, or something bad, something that bad people do, the political. And therefore, for example, and I'll give you the hilarious, sad example in Egypt, when somebody who is pro-Sisi women wanted to defend him, she said, he's a good man, he's not like those horrible activists. He doesn't do politics. He doesn't know politics, he's not political. You wonder, okay, what's he doing there? And political is the negotiation. Twitter and Facebook, to a lesser degree, made us, as Arabic speakers, and I speak about the Arabic speakers, have a collective conversation that brings our communal memories, the good communal memories, but also to make us remember that the political is about the negotiation of powers in a community, who has the power of one. And this is very exciting. Many of us didn't realize it, even though we practice it every day. The dictators did. I told you, they're always 10 steps ahead of us, unfortunately.
They need to be, and there's really interesting nuance and difference to how Twitter kind of plays out in the West as well, in terms of it's been seen a lot more in terms of lambasting each other and less about the functionality of politics. Yeah. We have time for a couple more questions. Has anyone got any more? No? We're all done? All right, that's it. Thank you very much to our speakers, and thanks for being here. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Thank you. If you want to go, go.